The dusty road wasn't just a memory etched into the mind of the man sitting in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the dressing room. It was a calling. It was that long, unpaved stretch of caliche dirt back in Texas that led to the front gate of the ranch, the only place where the noise of the world finally died down enough for a man to hear his own heartbeat. But George Strait wasn't in Texas. He was in the bowels of the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, surrounded by white leather sofas, untouched fruit platters, and the lingering metallic taste of adrenaline that always followed a 2-hour set. At 71 years old, the adrenaline didn't burn clean like it used to. It left behind a residue of deep, bone-weary exhaustion that settled into his knees and his lower back, a heaviness that felt like wearing a wet wool coat. He stared at his reflection in the vanity mirror, the bright bulbs illuminating the lines around his eyes, lines that the fans called character, but he knew were simply the roadmap of a life spent under hot lights and heavy hats. He reached up and slowly removed the black resistal, placing it upside down on the counter, with the reverence of a ritual performed thousands of times. Usually this was the moment the door would click open. Usually this was the moment Norma would walk in, smelling of vanilla and grace, holding a bottle of room-temperature water and a fresh towel. She would look at him with those eyes that had seen him as a nobody, a soldier, a father, and a king, and she would simply say, "Good show, George." That was the anchor. That was the ritual that signaled the work was done and the husband could return. But the door didn't open. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. Instead of Norma, the heavy steel door creaked open to reveal Jim, his tour manager for the better part of 2 decades. Jim was a man built like a linebacker, with a constitution of steel, someone who had handled drunk fans, greedy promoters, and logistical nightmares without breaking a sweat. But tonight, Jim looked pale. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He didn't have water. He didn't have a towel. He was clutching his smartphone with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit he knew didn't exist. George turned in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He frowned, a subtle shift in his expression that was more terrifying to his staff than any shout could be. He didn't need to raise his voice, he just needed to look. "Where's Norma?" George asked, his voice a low rumble, still raspy from the encore. Jim swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He took a step forward, then stopped as if an invisible barrier separated him from the legend sitting at the vanity. "George," Jim started, his voice cracking. She's back at the hotel." She went ahead. "Without saying goodbye?" George narrowed his eyes. In 50 years, Norma had never left the venue without him, not once. Not when the kids were sick, not when she was tired. They arrived together, they left together. That was the deal. "Jim, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jim exhaled a shaky breath and walked over, placing the phone on the vanity table. He slid it across the polished surface. The screen was already lit up, paused on a video frame. "I tried to stop it, George. We have the PR team trying to scrub it, but it's everywhere. It went viral 20 minutes ago while you were singing Amarillo by Morning. You need to see this." George looked at the phone with disdain. He hated these devices. He hated the way they reduced life to pixels and sound bites. But he picked it up. His large, calloused hand, a hand that had roped steers and strummed chords for half a century, felt clumsy against the sleek glass. He pressed play. The video was shaky, filmed vertically from a low angle, likely by a stagehand or a janitor hiding behind a stack of road cases. The location was unmistakable, the corridor leading to the executive suites, just off the main backstage area. In the center of the frame was Norma. George's heart hammered against his ribs. She looked distressed. Her face, usually composed and serene, was flushed. Her hands were flying in the air, frantic. Standing opposite her was a man George recognized vaguely. Brad, a young, sharp-suited executive from the new promotion company handling the Vegas residency. A man with a smile too bright and shoes too expensive. In the video there was no sound, just the grainy image. Norma was shouting something, her chest heaving. Then the moment that stopped George's heart cold. She collapsed forward, burying her face in Brad's chest. It wasn't a stumble. It looked like a surrender. And Brad wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight, his hand stroking the back of her head, his face close to hers. It looked intimate. It looked like a shared secret. It looked like a lover comforting a woman who could no longer bear the weight of her double life. The video looped, Norma crying, Brad holding her, the intimacy of the embrace undeniable in the low resolution. George set the phone down. He didn't slam it. He placed it down gently, but the sound of the plastic hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He felt a coldness spread from his stomach to his fingertips. It was a physical sensation, a numbness that made his extremities tingle. "Read the caption," Jim whispered, regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. George looked again. Below the video, the bold text screamed in the way only internet headlines could, "The End of the King." Norma Strait'S spotted an intimate breakdown with young music exec while George performs. Is the fairy tale over? George closed his eyes. He saw the last 50 years flash behind his eyelids. The high school romance in Pearsall, the elopement in Mexico, the years in the army, the dusty honky-tonks where she sat in the front row when nobody knew his name, the loss of their daughter, the grief that should have broken them but welded them together instead. He thought they were iron. He thought they were the exception to the rule of celebrity marriages. "Get the car," George said. His voice was void of emotion. It was dead. "George, maybe we should wait until the crowd—" "Get the car." He stood up, ignoring the ache in his knees. He grabbed his jacket, but he didn't put his hat back on. He felt exposed, naked, but he couldn't bear the weight of the cowboy persona right now. He wasn't the king of country in this moment. He was just a man who felt the ground beneath him turn into quicksand. Walking through the back tunnels of the arena was a blur. The security team formed a phalanx around him, but they couldn't block the energy. The staff, the roadies, the catering crew, people who usually greeted him with smiles and high fives, were averting their gazes. They had all seen it. They were looking at the floor, looking at their shoes, looking anywhere but at the man whose wife was trending on Twitter for all the wrong reasons. The shame was a physical heat on the back of his neck. They burst out of the service exit into the cool desert night. The SUV was waiting, engine running, but so were they, the paparazzi. Usually George Strait commanded a level of respect that kept the vultures at bay. He wasn't a scandal maker. He didn't give them fodder. But blood was in the water now and the sharks were frenzied. As soon as the heavy metal doors swung open, the night exploded in blinding white flashes. "George! George! Did you know about Brad? Is it true you're living in separate houses? George, look this way. Are you filing for divorce? How long has she been seeing him?" The questions were shouted with a vulgar casualness that made George's hands curl into fists. A microphone boom pole swung dangerously close to his face. A young photographer with a desperate look in his eyes shoved a phone in his face, displaying the freeze frame of Norma in Brad's arms. "She looks pretty cozy, George. What do you have to say?" George stopped. For a split second, the old cowboy instinct, the one that didn't take insults lightly, flared up. He wanted to grab the man. He wanted to roar. But then he remembered who he was. He remembered that anger would only feed the beast. He looked at the photographer with eyes so full of sorrow and icy dignity that the man actually stepped back, lowering the camera. George climbed into the back seat of the black Suburban. The door slammed shut, cutting off the noise, but the damage was done. The silence inside the car was worse than the screaming outside. Jim sat in the front passenger seat, typing furiously on his phone, likely trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. "Take me to the bus," George said. "The hotel, sir? Norma is—" "The bus," George repeated, staring out the tinted window at the neon blur of the Las Vegas Strip. "I'm not going to the hotel." He couldn't see her, not yet. If he saw her, he would ask questions, and he was terrified of the answers. What if it was true? What if the exhaustion of the road, the endless tour dates, the pressure of being Mrs. King George had finally broken her? Brad was young. He was vibrant. He was part of the new world that George felt increasingly alienated from. Maybe she was tired of the dusty road. Maybe she wanted something he couldn't give her anymore. The driver nodded and steered the vehicle toward the bus lot on the outskirts of the city, away from the glitz of the Strip. When George finally stepped onto his tour bus, the mystery, he locked the door behind him. The interior was dark, smelling of leather and cedar. He walked to the back lounge and sat down on the sofa. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, pulling the phone out of his pocket again. He watched the video again, and again. 2 million views. 3 million views. The comments were a toxic slurry of judgment. User 123. Typical. She stuck around for the money. Now she wants the fun. Texas Girl 88. I'm crying. If George and Norma can't make it, love is a lie. Music Insider. I heard rumors about this Brad guy. He's a climber. She's his ticket. George felt a tear trace a path down his weathered cheek. He wiped it away angrily. He felt foolish. He felt like the punchline of a joke he hadn't heard yet. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hand trembling slightly. His phone buzzed. Norma calling. He stared at the name on the screen. The letters blurred. He let it ring. It went to voicemail. It buzzed again. Norma calling. He couldn't do it. He turned the phone off. The night dragged on, a torture of silence and dark thoughts. George Strait, the man who had sung about heartache in 1,000 different ways, was finally learning that the songs didn't come close to the real thing. The songs had melodies. They had resolutions in 3 minutes and 30 seconds. This pain had no melody. It was just a dull, grinding noise in his head. Morning broke over the desert with a harsh, unforgiving light. George hadn't slept. He was still in his stage clothes, the starch in his shirt wilted, his eyes red-rimmed. He needed coffee. He needed to think. He stepped out of the bus, hoping the early hour meant privacy. He was wrong. They were at the fence line of the bus lot. Telephoto lenses poked through the chain link like rifle barrels. As soon as he stepped out, the shouting began again. But this time, it wasn't just the paparazzi. A news van was there. A reporter with perfect hair and a microphone was broadcasting live. We're here live where country legend George Strait has reportedly spent the night alone on his tour bus following the explosive viral video of his wife. George retreated inside, slamming the door. He leaned his back against it, breathing hard. He was trapped. He was a prisoner in his own life. A knock came at the door, not the rhythmic knock of the press, but a specific code. Knock, knock, pause, knock. It was Jim. George opened the door a crack. Jim slipped inside, looking even worse than the night before. She's downstairs in the lobby of the hotel, George, Jim said quietly. She's trying to get a cab to come here, but the security won't let her leave because of the mob. She's hysterical. She says you won't answer her calls. What is there to say, Jim? George walked to the small kitchenette and poured the stale coffee down the sink. The whole world saw it. She was in his arms. She looked at him like he was saving her. Maybe you should ask her what she needed saving from, Jim said. It was a bold statement, one that overstepped the boundaries of employee and employer, but Jim had been there a long time. George froze. What does that mean? I don't know, George. I just know Norma. I know that woman would take a bullet for you. I know she's ironed your shirts every night since 1971. Does that video make sense to you? Does it match the woman you wake up next to? George looked at his hands. Did it? The doubt was a poison, but underneath the doubt, there was a flicker of something else. A memory of her hand in his, a memory of her whispering prayers when he went on stage. She's with the promoters, Jim added. They're having a crisis meeting at the arena in an hour. Brad will be there, the head of the label will be there. They want to spin this. They want to release a statement saying she was drunk or sick. George's head snapped up. They want to say she was drunk? That's the strategy. Blame it on her. Protect the tour. Protect the brand. A fire ignited in George's chest. It wasn't the jealousy of the night before. It was something older, something primal. It was the protective instinct of a husband who hears someone threatening his wife. Even if she had betrayed him, she was still Norma. And no suit-wearing executive was going to drag her name through the mud to save ticket sales. Get the truck, George said. This time his voice wasn't dead. It was cold steel. George, the press is... I don't care about the press. Drive the bus through the gate if you have to. Take me to the arena. I'm not letting them write the narrative of my wife's life. The ride back to the venue was a blur of motion. George didn't look at his phone. He put his hat back on. He pulled the brim down low. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was preparing for battle. He didn't know what he would find in that room. Maybe he would find confirmation of his worst fears. Maybe Brad would look him in the eye and admit it. But George Strait was going to look them in the eye. He was going to hear it from the source. The arena was eerie in the daylight, a cavernous skeleton of steel and concrete without the lights and the fans. The cleaning crews were sweeping up the confetti from the night before. George walked with a purpose, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. Jim trailed behind him, struggling to keep up with the long strides of the cowboy. They reached the green room complex. The door to the main conference room was closed, but voices were leaking out. Loud voices. Angry voices. George didn't knock. He didn't wait to be announced. He reached out, grabbed the handle, and threw the door open. The room fell silent instantly. Around the long glass table sat the power players, the tour promoter, a heavy-set man named Miller, the label head, a PR crisis team. And in the corner, looking small and terrified, sat Brad. But George didn't look at them. He looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. "Where is she?" George asked. Miller stood up, putting on a fake smile. "George, we didn't expect you. We're just handling this mess. We've got a great statement drafted. We're going to say Norma had a reaction to medication, a moment of confusion. It clears you completely, keeps the tour." "I asked," George said, stepping into the room and letting the door close behind him. "Where is my wife?" "She's in the holding room next door," Brad squeaked. The young man looked like he was about to vomit. He was pale, sweating. He looked nothing like the confident lover in the video. He looked like a kid who had broken a priceless vase. George turned his gaze to Brad. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. George walked slowly toward him. Brad shrank back into his chair. "You're the one in the video," George said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Straight, please, Brad stammered. "Stand up," George commanded. Brad stood up, his legs shaking. He was taller than George, but he looked minuscule in his presence. "You had your hands on my wife," George said softly. "The whole world saw it." "It's not what you think," Brad blurted out, tears springing to his eyes. "I swear on my mother's life, Mr. Straight, it's not what you think. Please, you have to watch the real video." George paused. "The real video?" "The one online. It's edited, it's cut, it has no sound. My assistant, she was filming for TikTok, she only caught the end. But the security camera, the venue has cameras in the hallway. I have the footage. I showed them." Brad pointed to Miller and the label head. "But they said it doesn't matter. They said the scandal sells tickets. They said—" George turned his head slowly toward Miller. The promoter looked away, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Show me," George said to Brad. Brad fumbled with a tablet on the table. His fingers were trembling so bad he had to tap the screen 3 times. "Here, this is the raw feed from camera 4. It has audio." George looked down at the tablet. The angle was different, high up, wide. It showed the whole hallway. It showed Norma standing there, waiting. It showed Brad walking up to her, holding a clipboard. George leaned in. He pressed play. The audio was tinny, but clear. And then, he heard her voice. The tablet screen was small, but the reality it projected was larger than life. George leaned over the glass table, his hands gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned the color of old ivory. The room was dead silent, save for the tinny, distorted audio emanating from the device. On the screen, the timestamp read 11:42 p.m., 20 minutes after George had left the stage the previous night. The wide-angle lens of the security camera captured the hallway in stark black and white. There was Norma. She wasn't flirting. She wasn't sneaking around. She was cornering Miller, the heavy-set promoter sitting right there at the table, and Brad, the young executive. Norma's voice cut through the speaker, shrill and trembling with a rage George had rarely heard in 5 decades of marriage. "I don't care what the contract says, Miller," Norma screamed in the video. She slammed a stack of papers against the wall. "Look at him. Have you looked at his hands? They shake after the show. He's 71 years old. Not a machine you can just plug in and play." In the conference room, Miller shifted uncomfortably in his expensive Italian leather chair, refusing to meet George's eyes. George didn't blink. He watched his wife. On the screen, Miller was gesturing dismissively at Norma. Although Miller's voice was muffled in the recording, Norma's response was crystal clear. 10 more dates? You want to add 10 more dates to the winter leg? You will kill him. Do you hear me? He won't say no because he's too proud, because he loves the fans too much. But I am the one who puts ice on his back at 2 a.m. I am the one who sees him wince when he puts his boots on. George felt a lump form in his throat, a hard, painful obstruction that made it difficult to breathe. He had hidden the pain. He thought he was being stoic. He thought he was protecting her from the reality of his aging body. But she had seen. She had always seen. The video continued. Norma was crying now, tears of pure frustration. I won't let you do it. I will burn this tour to the ground before I let you work him into a grave just so you can buy another house in Aspen. That was the moment. The energy left her. The sheer exhaustion of the fight caused her knees to buckle. She stumbled forward. Brad, the young executive, didn't embrace her out of lust. He caught her out of necessity. He stepped in to keep an elderly woman from hitting the concrete floor. I've got you, Mrs. Straight, I've got you. Brad's voice came through the audio, thin and panicked. It's okay. We'll cancel the dates, I promise. Just breathe. That was the clip. That was the affair. That was the betrayal. It was a woman fighting a war for her husband's life, a war she was fighting alone because she didn't want him to know how fragile he had become. George straightened up slowly. The silence in the conference room was now heavy with a different kind of tension. It wasn't the tension of a scandal. It was the terrifying pressure of judgment. George Straight looked at Miller. The look wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was the look of a man who has realized he is sitting at a table with snakes. You knew, George said. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder rolling across the West Texas plains. You saw the viral clip. You saw the headlines destroying my wife's reputation. And you sat here, with the full video in your possession, and decided to do nothing. Miller cleared his throat, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace. George, listen, it's business. The viral video, it's trending #1 globally. Ticket sales for the remaining shows have spiked 40% since this morning. People want to see the drama. We were going to release a statement later, clearing her name, but we thought we'd ride the wave for a smack. George's hand hit the table. It wasn't a violent strike, but the authority behind it silenced Miller instantly. You thought you'd ride the wave, George repeated, his voice trembling with restrained fury. You were willing to let the world call my wife a whore to sell a few more nosebleed seats? George turned to Brad. The young man flinched, expecting the wrath of the king. Send that video to my phone, George said softly. Yes, sir, right away, sir, Brad stammered, his fingers flying across the tablet. George turned back to Miller. He picked up his hat from the table and placed it on his head, adjusting the brim until it cast a shadow over his eyes. Miller, you're fired. Get your team, get your lawyers, and get out of this building. If I see you in the arena when I come back, I won't be calling security. I'll be handling it the way we handled trespassers in Pearsall. You can't fire me, George. The contract was with George Straight, the entertainer, George said, turning his back on him. You just pissed off George Straight, the husband, and he doesn't give a damn about your contract. George walked out of the room. He didn't look back. The walk from the conference room to the holding area felt like a pilgrimage. Every step was heavy with guilt. How could he have doubted her? How could 50 years of coffee in the morning, of raising children, of burying parents, of holding hands in the dark? How could all of that be erased by a 15-second video on a screen? He felt old, not physically but spiritually. He realized that the modern world, with its rush to judgment and its addiction to scandal, had infected him too. He had let the noise in. He had let the dusty road of their life together be obscured by the smog of public opinion. If you believe that loyalty is a currency that has lost its value in this modern world, and if you think a man should stand by his woman when the storm hits, take a moment to subscribe. Because this story isn't just about a singer, it's about the fight for truth. George reached the door of the holding room. It was a small windowless office used for storage, now serving as a bunker for the most hated woman on the internet. He hesitated. His hand hovered over the knob. What if she wouldn't forgive him? He hadn't answered her calls. He had locked the bus door. He had let her sit in the lobby of the hotel while the wolves circled. That was a betrayal far deeper than any physical affair. He took a deep breath, removed his hat again, a sign of total surrender, and opened the door. Norma was sitting on a folding chair, staring at a blank wall. Her suitcase was next to her. She was still wearing the clothes from the night before, though they looked wrinkled now. Her eyes were red, swollen almost shut. She held a tissue that had been shredded to pieces in her anxious hands. When the door opened, she flinched. She looked up, fear in her eyes. She expected another lawyer. She expected another reporter. When she saw George, her shoulders slumped, but she didn't smile. She didn't rush to him. She just looked at him with a profound sadness. "Did you sign the papers?" she asked, her voice raspy. George frowned, stepping inside and closing the door softly. "What papers, Norma?" "The divorce papers, or the separation agreement, whatever Miller drafted." She looked down at her hands. "I saw the news, George. They said you slept on the bus. They said you wouldn't look at me." George felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. He dropped his hat on a stack of boxes and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt down in front of her, ignoring the sharp pain in his knees. He took her hands. They were cold. "Norma," he whispered, "look at me." She shook her head. "I didn't do it, George. I know what it looked like, but I swear to God I was so tired. I was fighting for you." "I know," George said, his voice cracking. "I know, honey. I saw the tape, the real tape." Norma looked up then, her eyes searching his face. "You saw it?" "I saw you fighting Miller. I heard you defending me. I heard you telling them that I wasn't a machine." George brought her hands to his lips, kissing the knuckles that were swollen from arthritis, the hands that had held his life together. "I am so sorry, Norma. I am so sorry I didn't answer the phone. I was a fool. I was a jealous, old fool." "You were hurt," Norma said softly, pulling one hand away to touch his cheek. "It looked bad, George. Even I know it looked bad. It doesn't matter what it looked like. I should have known. I should have known you." A tear escaped George's eye, tracking through the deep lines of his face. 50 years, and I let a stranger with a camera make me doubt you. I don't deserve you, Norma. I never have." Norma let out a watery laugh, a sound that broke the tension in the room. "Well, you're stuck with me, cowboy, unless you want to go out there and tell those reporters you're single." George's expression hardened. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by a steely resolve. He stood up, pulling Norma up with him. He didn't let go of her hand. "No," George said. "I'm not going to tell them I'm single. I'm going to tell them exactly who you are." He reached for his hat and placed it back on his head. He adjusted it, not to hide this time, but to assume the mantle of the king. "Where are we going?" Norma asked, wiping her face. "Back to the bus?" "No," George said. "We're going to the lobby. The press is waiting. They want a story. They want a scandal. I'm going to give them one, but it's not the one they think." "George, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. They disrespected you, Norma. And by disrespecting you, they disrespected us. I'm not leaving this town until every single person knows that you aren't the villain of this story. You're the hero." He turned to the door, but stopped. He looked back at her, his blue eyes piercing. "And Norma?" "Yes, George? We're canceling the winter leg. We're canceling the extra dates. We're going home, to the ranch, to the real road." Norma's lips trembled. "But the money? The contract?" "To hell with the money," George said, opening the door. "I'd rather be broke in Pearsall with you than rich in Vegas without you. Now come on, we have a show to put on." They walked out of the holding room hand in hand. The corridor was long, leading back toward the main atrium of the hotel where the press had set up camp. As they walked, the staff they passed didn't avert their eyes this time. They saw the look on George's face. They saw the grip he had on his wife's hand. They stepped aside, pressing their backs against the walls, sensing that a storm was coming. Jim met them at the end of the hallway. He looked at George, then at Norma, and a wave of relief washed over his face. "The press is in a frenzy, George," Jim warned. "There are about 50 cameras in the atrium. Security is holding them back, but it's a zoo." "Good," George said. "Jim, do you still have the hookup to the main PA system in the lobby?" Jim blinked. "The hotel PA? Yeah, I can access it from the control panel." "Why?" George handed Jim the tablet with the security footage. "I want you to cue up the audio, just the audio. When I give the signal, you play it. Loud. Jim looked at the tablet, then at George. A slow smile spread across the tour manager's face. "With pleasure, boss." George turned to Norma. "You ready?" Norma took a deep breath. She smoothed her blouse. She lifted her chin. She was a woman who had stood beside a legend for half a century. She had a steel of her own. "I'm ready." The double doors to the atrium swung open. The noise hit them like a physical wave. The flashbulbs were blinding, a strobe light of chaos. Shouts erupted from the sea of reporters. "George! George! Is it over?" "Norma, did you love him?" "Look here! Look here!" They expected a broken couple. They expected George to walk 10 feet ahead, or for them to come out with lawyers reading a prepared statement. Instead, George Strait walked straight into the center of the room, holding Norma's hand high in the air, tight and unyielding. He didn't stop at the edge. He walked right up to the bank of microphones that had been set up for the apology press conference Miller had planned. The room quieted down, confused by his demeanor. He wasn't sad. He looked dangerous. George leaned into the microphone. His voice was calm, the deep baritone that had sold 100 million records. "You all seem to have a lot of questions about my wife," George said. The silence deepened. "You saw a video. You wrote your headlines. You decided you knew the truth about a marriage that has lasted longer than most of you have been alive." He scanned the crowd. He saw the reporter who had asked if she was unhappy. He locked eyes with him. "You wanted to know what was happening in that hallway," George continued. "You wanted to know why my wife was crying. You assumed it was sin. You assumed it was betrayal." He raised his hand, signaling to Jim, who was standing in the shadows of the mezzanine. "Well," George said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed through the massive hall, "here is the truth." Click. The speakers in the ceiling crackled. And then Norma's voice, amplified to a deafening volume, filled the entire hotel lobby. The lobby of the Las Vegas Hotel, a cathedral of marble and gold leaf, usually filled with the murmur of tourists and the chime of slot machines, was now drowning in the raw, unpolished sound of a woman's desperation. "I don't care what the contract says, Miller." The voice booming from the overhead speakers wasn't the polished alto of a country song. It was shrill, distorted, and undeniably real. The reporters, who had been jostling for position just seconds before, froze. Cameras lowered, mouths hung open. The audio was so loud it vibrated in the chests of everyone present. "Look at him. Have you looked at his hands? They shake after the show. He's 71 years old, not a machine you can just plug in and play." George stood at the podium, his hand still firmly clasping Norma's. He didn't look at the speakers, he looked at the crowd. He watched the realization wash over them. He watched the smug expressions of the tabloid journalists dissolve into confusion, and then shame. Norma squeezed his hand. She was trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the sheer exposure of her private battle. George squeezed back, an anchor in the storm. 10 more dates? You want to add 10 more dates to the winter leg? You will kill him." The audio clip continued, playing through the moment of the so-called betrayal. The crowd heard the sob that ripped from her throat. They heard the thud of the papers hitting the wall, and crucially they heard Brad's voice clear as a bell. "I've got you, Mrs. Strait. We'll cancel the dates, I promise." The audio cut out with a sharp static hiss. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. It was a vacuum. George leaned back into the microphone. He waited a beat, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "That," George said, his voice low and steady, "is the woman you spent the last 24 hours crucifying." He looked down at Norma, his eyes softening for the first time. Then he looked back up, his gaze hardening into flint. "You saw a woman crying in the arms of a colleague and you called it infidelity. I see a woman who was fighting a room full of sharks to protect my health, while I was too proud to admit I was tired. I see a wife who was willing to be the villain to the promoters so that I could keep being the hero to the fans." A flashbulb popped, lonely and awkward. Then another, but the frenzy was gone. The narrative had shifted so violently that the room seemed to tilt. "The man in that video," George continued, "wasn't a lover. He was the only person in that room with enough decency to catch a woman who was collapsing from the weight of carrying me." George took a step back from the podium, but he didn't leave. He pulled Norma forward. She hesitated, but he nodded. "It's okay," he mouthed. Norma stepped up. She was shorter than the microphone, so George adjusted it for her. She looked out at the sea of faces, the people who had mocked her, judged her, memified her pain. "I love George," she said simply. Her voice didn't boom, it wavered, human and fragile. "I have loved him since we were kids in Pearsall, and loving someone means protecting them, even from themselves, even from the things they love, like the stage." She paused, taking a breath. "I didn't want to be the reason the music stopped, but I couldn't be the reason he didn't come home." A single applause started from the back of the room. It was Jim. Then slowly the hotel staff joined in. Then surprisingly the reporters. It wasn't a raucous ovation. It was a respectful, chastened applause. A recognition of a truth that was rare in their world. George put his arm around her shoulders. "We're going home," he announced. "The rest of the tour is cancelled, not because of a scandal, but because my wife says it's time to rest. And if there's one thing I've learned in 50 years, it's that Norma is always right." He tipped his hat to the crowd, a final, definitive gesture. Then he turned, guiding Norma away from the microphones, through the parted sea of journalists who now moved aside with reverence. They didn't shout questions anymore. They just watched the king and his queen walk away. The aftermath was swift and brutal for everyone but the Strait'S. By the time the black Suburban pulled onto the highway leaving Las Vegas, the internet had done a complete 180-degree turn. The hashtag Team Norma was trending worldwide, replacing the vitriol of the morning. The audio clip had been shared millions of times, dubbed over videos of people defending their loved ones. Norma wasn't just exonerated, she was canonized. She became the symbol of the fierce, quiet strength behind the throne. Miller, the promoter, was fired before the sun set. The record label, scrambling to save face, issued a public apology to the Straight family and announced a donation to a charity of Norma's choosing. Brad, the young executive, found himself surprisingly popular, praised for his decency in a moment of crisis. But none of that mattered inside the truck. George and Norma sat in the back, the desert landscape blurring past the window. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was the comfortable silence of two people who had weathered a hurricane and found the house still standing. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He rolled down the window. The wind roared into the cabin, hot and dry. "What are you doing, George?" Norma asked, alarmed. "I don't need this anymore," George said. "I don't need to know what they say. I don't need the validation. I have everything I need right here." He didn't throw it, though. That would be littering, and George Strait didn't litter. He just turned it off. He powered it down completely, watching the screen go black. He tossed it onto the empty seat opposite them. "We're really going home?" Norma asked, looking at him. "You're not going to miss it? The lights, the applause?" George looked at her. He looked at the lines on her face, the grey in her hair, the eyes that knew him better than he knew himself. He thought about the dusty road leading to the ranch. He thought about the horses waiting. He thought about the quiet mornings with coffee on the porch. "Norma," he said, taking her hand and kissing the palm. "I've had enough applause to last 10 lifetimes, but I almost lost you because I was too busy listening to it. I'm not going to miss the noise. I'm going to miss the time we wasted." He leaned back, closing his eyes. "Besides," he added, a small smirk playing on his lips, "I think I've got one more song in me, a real one, about a woman who fought the devil in a hallway to save a cowboy." Norma laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Just don't make it too sappy, George." "No promises," he murmured. 6 months later. The Texas sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and burnt orange. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth. The only sound was the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair and the distant lowing of cattle. George sat on the porch of his ranch in Pearsall. He was wearing an old flannel shirt, his boots scuffed and dusty. He wasn't the king of country here. He was just George. He held a guitar in his lap, idly picking a melody. It was slow, melancholic, but with a thread of steel running through it. Norma came out of the screen door carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one down on the railing next to him and sat in the chair beside him. She looked healthy. The stress of the tour, the frantic energy of Vegas, was gone. She looked like herself again. "You get that fence fixed in the south pasture?" she asked. "Yep," George said, not stopping his playing. "Took all afternoon. My back's reminding me I'm not 30 anymore." "Good thing you have a nurse," she teased. George stopped playing. He put his hand over the strings to silence them. He looked out at the horizon where the dusty road stretched out toward the gate, the same road that led away to the world of fame and noise. "I haven't looked at a headline in 6 months," George said quietly. "Me neither," Norma said. "They say the tour cancellation cost us about $10 million, George mused. Norma took a sip of her coffee. "Is that a regret I hear in your voice, Mr. Straight?" George turned to look at her. The setting sun caught the gold band on his finger, the same one he'd worn for 50 years. "No," he said. "It was the best money I ever spent." He picked up the guitar again. He started to sing, his voice rougher now, stripped of the studio polish, singing only for an audience of one. "The world can have the melodies, the lights, and all the fame. But when the curtain falls and no one remembers my name, I'll take the silence of the porch, the dusty road, the truth. I'll take the fight you fought for me, the wasted days of youth." They saw a broken picture, but they didn't hear the sound of an angel fighting demons, standing firmly on the ground. Norma smiled, closing her eyes to listen. The camera pulls back slowly, leaving them there on the porch. 2 small figures against the vast, darkening Texas sky. The dust from the road settles, quiet and still. The noise of the world is far away, unable to touch them. The legend fades, but the man and the woman remain. And that, in the end, was the only story that mattered.